ahead and start letting. Okay. It takes a few minutes to introduce everything, so we'll see what we get here.
Yeah, that would be your UC Merced one it was going to.
Okay. Okay. We'll see. I do everything by Dropbox because I never know where people have like limits on their inbox size.
That is going to worry me, right?
Folks,
it's like megs. So
yeah. Folks, if you're joining, and when you would like to ask a question, we hold all questions until the end of the seminar. And there on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little toolbar that pops up. And if you would like to ask a question, we ask that you put it in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A. And when we get to the end of the presentation, we usually have time for a few questions out of the Q&A, and then anything that we don't get to in the main seminar, we will bring those questions with us over into the discussion. We do have a very informal discussion with the speaker from the 4 to 5 o'clock Pacific time hour, and that will actually take place in a different Zoom so that it can be an actual discussion. And so as we get towards the end of the seminar here, we will place the link for that discussion in the chat. It is also in the weekly email that you receive from this list, if you, assuming you are on the listserv, since you got the link for the Zoom. So we will move towards that at the 4 o'clock hour and take additional questions and have opportunities to chat. I would also like to note that our partner in advertising the seminar more broadly is the California Fire Science Consortium, and we're grateful for that partnership, and it will continue into the future, we hope. And the seminar goes until May 11th, so we've got just 3 more weeks after this one, 3 more weeks of speakers, and I think that's everything I can think of for today. Okay, so without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our speaker for the day. And Brandon, I will note that I have not seen it pop into my inbox yet. So we'll just see how it goes here while I'm introducing you. So our speaker today is Dr. Brandon Collins, who's a research scientist in a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and Pacific Southwest Research Station and the UC Berkeley Center for Fire Research and Outreach. He's also an adjunct professor with UC Berkeley, the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management. Brandon has a bachelor's in forestry from Berkeley, an MS in forest science from Colorado State University, and a doctorate in wildland fire science from UC Berkeley. His research interests involve investigating effects of fire and fuels treatments on forests. Much of his research is intended to directly inform forest management, with particular emphasis on improving resilience to wildfire and drought. And he is demonstrating that today in that he is currently at the Blodgett Experimental Forest, taking advantage of a burn window. And so his internet is a little bit less stable than most of our speakers normally are. And that is why he's not going to be on video here for a second, and his audio is via phone. And we're trying to get the slide. Okay, come on. It's downloading. I've got the slides and they're just slowly coming up here, Brandon. So if you wanted to start talking a little bit about your work and what you do, and then I will get the slides up and running here in just a sec, okay?
Sure thing, I will. Okay, so by the way, thank you, Crystal. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation, Michael as well, and Jeanette too. This is a neat seminar series, and I appreciate being a part of it. And yes, I apologize for the shaky internet. You know, we had an opportunity for a burn that was supposed to happen last fall. Now we're taking advantage of this window, and I just been trying to juggle 2 things. But I'm going to try to deliver this seminar the best we can, and Crystal's going to advance the slides for me. So let me just give you a little background on the talk and where we're headed with it. So I have been working with historical forest reconstructions for some time now. And it started with some inventory data that we found in the National Archives. And these inventories came from the early part of the 1900s, early 20th century. And what it allowed us to do was have a really quantitative measure of the forest conditions in the early 1900s. And after finding that first one, we found another one from a different part of the Sierra Nevada, and then we found another one from a different part, and we just only recently found a fourth data set from the Southern Cascades. So where I'm headed with this is I wanted to introduce each of those data sets, and then another data set that wasn't an inventory, but actually some aerial photography, to try to give a picture of what we think forests were like historically. And the intent there is, you know, as a lot of people have already demonstrated, right? You know, there was, in the historical period where fires were more active, we had, you know, very different forests than we do now. And so what we've really tried to emphasize with some of this work is to try to explore some of the variability, not just the simple sort of answer of, yes, forests were more open and now they're more dense, but how much more open, how did that vary across a landscape? So those are some of the questions that we're trying to get to. And ultimately, the intent is to try to inform a restoration strategy at a landscape scale, really just trying to piece together these different data sets, along with some of the current knowledge of different species, preferences, adaptations, to try to weave these things together so we have a better strategy for managing forests, making them a little more resilient to fire and drought. So what we're looking at here, by the way, is a photograph taken in 1899. It was part of George Sudworth's work in the Sierra Nevada, and this, I think, was on the El Dorado National Forest. Just a neat overlook. Timing was pretty consistent with some of the data that we have. And just, I mean, even from this photograph, you can get a little bit of a sense of one, you know, in sort of the foreground and maybe even towards the left of that photo, that classic sort of open nature of the forest. But I think if you were to look to the right of the photograph, you can see that it wasn't all kind of uniformly open, right? There were some areas that were a little denser. There were even some natural openings. And so in any event, this picture was supposed to demonstrate that there was indeed variability, and that I'll demonstrate some of that with the data. So next slide, please. So this is what one of the sheets look like that we were able to obtain from this most recent inventory that was in the Southern Cascades. And the interesting thing about this one is it came from a privately held timberland, and all of our previous ones were from national forests. And so in this one, we got to ask kind of a neat question: is there something unique about the private land that would suggest perhaps even a slightly different restoration strategy on that land? And what we're looking at, if you are able to sort of zoom in, actually, maybe let's go to the next slide. That might show us a little better. So when you zoom in, each line here pertains to a quarter section. So if you are familiar at all with the public land survey system that we use in the West, we have townships and ranges, sections. These all identify a place on the ground based on a mapped system, a mapped coordinate system, and these are basically the smallest units of that system. They're 40 acres, and they're called quarter sections. And so each line, if it says northeast, or any, that means the northeast quarter of the northeast quadrat of that section. So it's kind of, the neat thing is that you can tie it to a piece of ground. And then from that, if you move along to the right, you'll see some of the estimates based on the inventory that was done. And this particular inventory was the most intense that we'd seen in terms of the percentage of area sampled. I think 40% of the area, so 40% of each quarter section, or each 40-acre unit, 40% of that was actually sampled, which is wild because right now, if you look at some of our sampling schemes, let's say, forest inventory and analysis, our percentages are much lower, right? We basically, for FIA, for forest inventory and analysis, we have one plot per 6,000 acres, right? So that very different in terms of the sampling intensity, and as a result, very different precision in terms of what you're able to characterize. So in this sense, if you look at this inventory, it gives us the estimate of the number of trees for a particular species, their average characteristics in terms of size and height, and then of course board feet, which is what the survey was really after, was the amount of timber in each of those. So in any event, pretty explicit, but not as good. Some of the other ones I'll show you in a little bit. Some of the other surveys we have actually have the trees. It's actually a count of the trees, so it's a little more explicit than just a summary at the 40-acre unit. So next slide, please. I didn't see it advance yet, Crystal. I don't know if you. There we go. Okay, sorry for that delay. Okay, so this is the area that it covers. So we're talking about mostly around the area of Lake Almanor. If you can see, sort of all the pink areas are the specific quarter sections where we have data. The yellow are the sections that they're within, and if it's a yellow, it has at least one quarter section within it with inventory data. So it spans quite a bit of area. I think if you were to sort of draw a what they call a convex hull polygon around the inventoried area, it's well over 100,000 acres. So it's a large chunk of land. For us, it was a little unique in that, for the most part, it was in the Southern Cascade region, which a lot of our other three inventory areas were in the Sierra Nevada, albeit they're still all in what you might call the classic sort of mixed conifer zone that spans, the Cascade even spans into the Klamath Range. But a neat area nonetheless, large enough to get us a true landscape scale estimate. Next slide, please. Okay, so we zoomed in on a particular area. There was a small section that we it was disjunct enough. If you saw that area that was just south of the Feather River, it was kind of closer to Quincy. We kind of lopped that off, and we focused on this Southern Cascade Range because it was more contiguous. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we were able to do with these data is you could, come up with a big a summary essentially of where we were again here. Oh, sorry for this. Of course, that has given us some specifics. So just to reiterate, we're talking about, if for this particular area, not including that little disjunct unit, we're about over 130,000 acres, and the number of transects is pretty amazing. We're almost at 1,400 transects, which is pretty amazing, especially when you think about the fact that it's a 40% sample. I mean, we're talking about a massive amount of area sampled. So if you include all of that area, if you draw a polygon around all of that pink, of course, there are some areas you can see where there is no pink, right? But if you average out all that area where it is sampled and where it isn't sampled, we essentially have a 20% sample of that contiguous polygon. So again, a pretty massive amount of area sampled. So a great data set. Next slide, please. So what we were able to get here is this is one of the things that's actually not so rewarding when you boil down almost 1,400 lines of observation into one line of a table. But it is kind of telling if any of you are familiar with some of these metrics by which we measure forest density. So there's a couple ways that we generally do it, one of which is just a simple tree count. In this case, it's only trees that are larger than 12 inches in diameter. That's all that was included in this inventory. So it's lacking in a sense that that we don't really have the full picture of maybe what some of those smaller size classes would have been. But in general, I think, for the majority of what was the dominant organisms on that particular site, we were able to capture them, but we're missing that small tail of the distribution, if you will. But in general, so we can characterize, just a simple tree count per acre, or we can measure it in terms of basal area, right? That is the cross-sectional area of tree, in this case, per unit acre. Okay, and so what we're able to, we have these two measures. If you just have simple tree count, you really don't have a sense of the size. If you're able to look at the tree count plus the basal area, you can get a sense of both, the number, the density, and the size of trees. So essentially, for any of you that are familiar with these numbers, these are incredibly low. 72 square feet of basal area is extremely low. It's actually lower than what, for the most part, what our forest practice rules on private land would allow us to go down to in what would be considered uneven age management. I think we're somewhere around 100 and 120 square feet is the lowest we can generally go in uneven age management. Of course, if you do clear cutting, you can cut it down to essentially zero and regenerate. But if you're doing uneven age management, you would actually be much, much higher than even what these sites were historically. So incredibly low, pine dominated, but not exclusively pine, so 60% pine, and then the rest being made up with incense cedar, white fir, and Douglas fir, and a small proportion of red fir. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we were able to do, this is sort of getting at that piece of variability, right? I was trying to do a more exploration of the data rather than just one simple line in a table of a summary. So by having the specific geographic units for which these observations are from, we could then try to explore what sort of biophysical factors may have been driving sort of the variability that we saw out there. And to tell you, to sort of cut to the chase here, if you look at the distribution, in this case, we're looking at the tree density, and sorry, I flipped now, we're at trees per hectare, before we were at trees per acre. Sorry, we kind of straddle that line sometimes in science where if we're talking to managers, we generally stick to the per acre, but now, this is, I think, more from the paper itself, and then it was reported in hectares, but bear with me for a moment on that one. And look at that distribution in the upper right. So what we're looking at that is that's all almost 1,400 plots plotted out along, the horizontal axis of trees per hectare. And essentially, we're not looking at a ton of variability in terms of the trees per hectare. So one of the things that is so surprising there is that when you look at the change from historical to contemporary, not only do we have, of course, many more trees, again, this is just trees greater than 12 inches, but we have a huge distribution now, much more variability. And, to a certain extent, I mean, it limited our ability to describe, what was driving variability, because there simply wasn't a ton of variability historically, but there was some, okay? And so what we were able to do was run this regression tree analysis, and we found that there were a few factors, mainly climatic factors, that were driving the variability. And essentially it boiled down to areas that were slightly warmer, but had higher precipitation, or in that sort of moderate range of precipitation, generally had the highest trees per acre. Some of the coldest areas actually had fairly low tree density. And if you look, by the way, if you're looking at the boxes that are colored orange, various shades of orange, when it says H, that's the historical tree density. So the number in there, that 37 or 42, that's the historical tree density. And then the N is the number of quarter sections that were in that particular, what is called a node. But essentially this algorithm of regression trees is simply just splitting the data. It's partitioning the data into more homogeneous groups. If you look at the boxes with the C next to it, that's the same exact areas under the contemporary condition, and you can look at some of the change. And the interesting thing there is that the change is not as uniform as you might think. Of course, yes, it's increased, but some areas have increased more than others. And I think one of the ones that stands out the most is the section all the way to the left that went from 37 trees per hectare historically to now to 170 trees per hectare. But in any event, this is a little confusing. It doesn't probably make a whole lot of sense, but what it does allow us is to map it. And you'll see that in the next slide, please. So advance to the next, thank you. And this is what you're able to do. So if you can then, if you know some of those climatic gradients that you can map out onto space, then you can map what the historical tree densities may have been and how they might have varied. And so we thought that this map was actually kind of a neat approximation. Granted, of course, it's extrapolating well outside of the sampled area. If you see those little green squares, that's just where the sampled area is. But given that we kind of clipped the extent to more or less the Cascade Range, the Southern Cascade Range, with similar topographic and elevational bounds as our data set. So we were able, again, to extrapolate a little bit further than the data itself to generate this, this map of predicted tree densities historically where we actually didn't have data. And you can see there's sort of a gradient. There's kind of a little bit of a north-south gradient, but a little bit of an east-west gradient as well. And we thought this would be a neat way, you know, a template by which you could then use for restoration, right? I think a lot of restoration projects currently are trying to get to a point where they don't just create one condition across the landscape. It's either treated or untreated. Instead, we'd like to maybe see a gradient of conditions, partly just for the fact that we want to be able to serve, you know, let's say habitat niches for a variety of species. And this, something like this map, granted, you know, there are a lot of issues with this map, but any method like this that's trying to, you know, trying to model some variability might then serve as a decent template by which we could then vary our restoration treatments across the landscape. Next slide, please. So again, this is another data source. This is from the Stanislaus, just to show you that this was actually one of the more explicit data sources that we had. This actually is we think, kind of the data sheet that was collected out in the field. It's a tally of trees by diameter classes on the left, by species. If you look at the bigger columns on the top, and by height. They recorded height and what they call the number of logs. So in any event, it gave us a lot more precision in terms of, you know, identifying the actual ranges of tree sizes and species distribution within a given quarter section, but more or less the same layout of the actual sampling. They ran transects through the middle of those quarter sections. Just a fabulous data source. This again was on the Stanislaus. Next slide, please. And again, we found these data sheets later for the Kern National Forest as well. The Kern no longer exists. It's been swallowed up into the Sequoia National Forest. But the same exact thing where we had these quarter sections with data sheets like this that have individual tree counts tied to it. Now, these areas are smaller. We're looking at 40 and 30, almost 30,000 acres respectively. But the neat thing is we gained some of that precision by having actual tree counts. And then also, you know, I should mention that the sampling intensity is actually lower on these. I told you we had about a 40% sample within a given quarter section on that Southern Cascade site. This sampling intensity was around 10, in some cases 20%. So next slide, please. This is what it looks like if you mapped it out in space, at least on the Stanislaus piece. By the way, if any of you know this area, the surveys actually went into what is now Yosemite National Park. There was kind of a land swap that took place around the 1930s, and what was the forest then became part of the park, and I think they traded some acres that were park and became forest somewhere else. But all of those white squares are areas, they're again quarter sections, they're 40-acre units for which we had these historical data. If you see those little dots, those are actually areas where we placed samples, where we went out and put plots in there and actually resampled around about 2010 is about when we did those. So really, again, really neat data source because we can tie it to the ground geographically. Next slide, please. Sorry, those are just some of the stats on there. Number of tree sample, we already saw that. Sorry, next slide, please. I shouldn't have the animations in this thing. Whoops, that one looks kind of funky on my end. But what we're trying to show here, I'm sorry this didn't come out right. What we were able to do here is there was actually quite a bit more variability on this Stanislaus site. Partly, I think, because we had a bigger elevational gradient. As we were going up into the park, we actually had we had some sites that would be probably considered almost true fir, right, where they were dominated by white and red fir, not necessarily in that pine, ponderous pine or mixed conifer zone. But by having more variability, we were able to then run this clustering algorithm statistically to come up with these groups, essentially. And if you look, sorry, again, the map is funky, at least the way I see it, but at least for what I can see in the lower left, in the legend, you can see the different groupings that we had, and essentially what some of the axes for these grouping were. One, the species, the dominant tree species. So we ranged from just pure ponderosa pine to Douglas fir, sugar pine, to pure fir, and then also we had another axis of density, where we had some areas that were extremely low basal area, some areas that were kind of in that moderate, and a few that were relatively high basal area, and then a third axis was actually the understory. That was one of the neat things that we got by having these data sheets that we didn't have for the previous one that I showed, is that when you had these data sheets, on the backside of that tree list that you saw were notes on the understory. And so we had species and their percent cover for that particular area, and that then filtered into this this clustering algorithm. So it was just a really neat way to understand that it wasn't just forests weren't just open everywhere. It wasn't just park-like everywhere, but in fact there was some variability, and that variability really went along those different axes that I just explained: understory, density, and then overstory species composition. Next slide, please. So these are some of the numbers that you would see if you were looking at the variability. Again, were the number of transects that are in a particular group, and these groups again came from a clustering algorithm. The second column is CHFO, that's bear clover. If any of you are familiar with bear clover, it had a pretty strong presence throughout our study site. The third column over is or fourth, I should say, is the shrub cover, and that was mainly Ceanothus and Arctostaphylos. And then if you keep going to your right, total basal area, then we have trees per acre. In this case, these are trees greater than 6 inches because that's what was included in this survey, whereas if you recall, the other survey was trees greater than 12 inches. And then we have a modeled canopy cover. That's a canopy cover that we derived by putting the tree list into a model called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, and it gave us an estimated canopy cover. Part of the interest in canopy cover there, by the way, is that there is, on Forest Service land, there is kind of a standard that which we generally, when we do a treatment, we generally do not thin below 40% canopy cover. And that's for various reasons, but largely for habitat concerns for a few key species. And the interesting thing here that over an area of about 40,000 acres, historically we had none of those particular areas really had anything over 30% canopy cover, and yet our lowest, our standard right now is set at 40. And you can see that some of the ranges were in the teens to the 20s. So it's just an interesting piece. It's not to say that just because it existed historically, we need to replicate it now. That's not my point. But my point is that if we are doing true full restoration, we might want to consider opening that range up that we're able to do some of our treatments. Next slide, please. This is a similar type of clustering algorithm that only generated 4 different groups. This is for that Southern Sierra collection of historical sites, or of historical transects on what was the Kern and now is the Sequoia National Forest. We only had 4 groups here, but quite a range. This was actually a bigger range than we saw before. If you look at some of those basal areas, remember all the way back to our Southern Cascade site, the site by Lake Almanor, we had an overall average of 72. Look at the range that we have here now in the Southern Sierra area. We have on the lowest end, and this actually corresponds to generally lower elevations in those pure ponderosa pine areas, 50 square feet of basal area. But if you got up into some of the higher elevation areas, we had about 180 square feet of basal area. And in general, those were kind of more evenly distributed among the different species. Ponderosa pine was still present in those higher basal area groups. We also had white fir, not Douglas fir, white fir, even some red fir, and then definitely incense cedar and sugar pine. So really interesting just to look at some of that variability and try to understand how we might tailor, how we might increase the complexity, perhaps maybe the heterogeneity of some of our contemporary restoration treatments that we're designing. And especially, by the way, think about it, covering, it's in a funky shape in general, but this particular study site is almost around 30,000 acres. And I think in general, we're trying to get up to that scale, maybe even bigger, maybe even 100,000 acres, for thinking about a planning area for some of our restoration projects. And so these could be decent templates. I wouldn't say these are copies that we would just say, okay, take that model and then project it out to our study. And no, that's probably not appropriate. But I think we could use these bounds perhaps, and then we could find some local, measures by which, we think that there are different gradients on a particular forest, and then apply those ranges throughout those gradients. So in any event, if I'm not clear enough already, I think we're really trying to hit this idea of variability across these historical forests. So next slide, please. Sorry for the delay. I think what we're getting on to now is our fourth site. This is on the El Dorado National Forest, and I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit. Next slide, please. What I'll tell you about this is it's another area. Both of these areas are actually slightly higher in elevation than the others. You can see we go all the way up to almost 8,000 feet, whereas the others, we were kind of in that 5,500 to 6,000 feet. And what we did this regression tree approach, the same one that I showed you from the Southern Cascade site. And in general, we saw a few different parameters pop up. There was more variability, by the way. I don't know if you remember that graph, and the axes were slightly different. But in general, we saw a much wider gradient of these tree densities in the historical data set, if you can just see that, by the way, looking at the histogram in the bottom left. And as a result, we think we got some decent predictions, or at least decent model representations of some of the factors that were driving that variability. Precipitation showed up in the previous one, if you remember, and then precipitation showed up here, by the way. And so this is just annual precipitation modeled out. I should have explained it. These are from the Flint data set, the basin characterization model. And so, the precipitation is estimated, based on the historical conditions. I think they went as far back as the 1930s with some of their reconstructions. But so looking at these variables, it's precipitation, snowpack, and then, in some cases, water deficit. Anyway, it's just, again, a template by which you could then, guide some of the restoration, guide some of the variability across the area, across some of your sites. And in this case, if you were looking all the way to the left, you have some of the lowest densities, right, about 40 trees per acre, but then it could span as much as to 100 trees per acre. And that, in some cases, if you didn't have these data, if you weren't comfortable with working with these climatic data or water deficit or anything like that, maybe you just do it based on elevation. I mean, that would be a decent approximation. It wouldn't be perfect, but it could work pretty well. But again, we're thinking about this, across large landscapes, how you might vary structure. And the point, again, is to meet multiple objectives. We're not just seeking forest restoration per se, but we're trying to, do restoration and provide some of these key habitat features, perhaps for the spotted owl, for example. If you don't mind, next slide, please. And again, it's things like, spotted owl, there's areas that want denser forest cover. Well, maybe we could use some of these variables to say where are some of the best places we think maybe to hold on to denser cover. If it existed there historically under a more intact fire regime, maybe it can exist into the future and withstand a few fires, just given that bioclimatic environment. Here's what we're able to do. Again, this is just like we did with the Southern Cascade site. We were able to plot or to map out historical tree densities across a much larger area than what was sampled. Again, those little black squares are just the area that was sampled. The extent, by the way, our extrapolation sort of extent was defined by it had to be within the El Dorado National Forest, and it had to be within that sort of elevational and climatic gradient that the historical data represented. So here's what it looks like. It's kind of interesting. Again, we see this north-south gradient. In this case, higher tree densities to the north. Next slide, please. And what you'll see, and as this next slide is coming up, that little outline right there, if any of you know that is the spotted owl, the California spotted owl demographic area for which population, that local population has been studied for over 30 years. And it's kind of interesting that that's some of the densest area, even historically, it was the densest. Next slide, please. And what you'll see, this, it's almost interesting that it may not be random, for example, that area was studied, but if any of you know what happened in that study area, that was burned by the King Fire. And that King Fire kind of teed up some of those areas, at least historically, that were a little bit denser. I'm not, connecting one with the other. I'm not saying that, but it is kind of interesting to map some of these things over space and look at some of the overlaps. Now, it's not to say that there's anything about the owls being there that caused the King Fire or any of that, but we do know that fire is causing quite an impact to that local population of owls, and it's probably not a very desirable effect for those owls. And so if we could think about that area, how you might tailor a restoration strategy in an area that's pretty dense with owls, you might still want to hold on to dense forests, but maybe you don't need them, as connected as they were, maybe just before the King Fire. Maybe we could use some of these historical data to look at how we might connect some of the denser areas or what those patch sizes might look like. Next slide, please. So now I've introduced these data sets. You're probably getting tired of them already. Sorry. But what it has allowed us to do then is to put them all together. So if you can guess where we're headed, we put them all together and created an even bigger map, extrapolating way beyond our data sources. But we think at least there is some utility in that. Here is if you look in the upper right, you'll see the map of the areas going from that southern Cascade site I talked about, and all the way in the north, the green being that El Dorado area that I just talked about, the orange being the Stanislaus area that I mentioned before, and then the red being that what was the Kern National Forest, now the Sequoia site. So we put those all together, all those data, and then try to basically create a model of what was driving variability across this much larger range. Next slide, please. And again, there's going to be a lot of imperfections with it, right? We're talking about 4 discrete data sources that, with a lot of holes, even within the study site, let alone how many holes are between it. But it's something to think about, right? I think if nothing else, it's something that you can maybe, use as a template, maybe to just generally think about how forests might have varied across the range. But I wouldn't go to a particular point on the map and say, well, their model predicted this for our spot, so this is what we should thin it down to. That's not the appropriate thing. It's really just looking at how much things varied in space and time. Again, if you look at this is that same regression tree approach we've talked about. We're using these climatic variables from the basin characterization model from the Flint data set to partition the data sources into these different what are supposedly more homogeneous categories. In this case, we have quite a huge number of plots. If you look at that N, just having put all those different quarter sections together, we have a pretty powerful data set. Granted, it has big holes in it, but it's pretty powerful. So next slide, please. And then you can see, by the way, there's quite a distribution associated with that. Now, this is kind of interesting. So what you're looking at all the way on the left is the historical live tree biomass. Now, we could have done this for basal area. We actually did. I'm not going to show it all. We did it for basal area. We did it for tree density. But in this case, we did it for biomass, partly just because of the connection to carbon. The state is quite interested in carbon in our forests for sequestering carbon, and it's always an interesting dilemma when it comes to our forests because they're fire prone, right? And so there is an inherent dilemma in trying to look to our forests to hold on to a lot of carbon when that carbon then makes it perhaps vulnerable to fire. And so we thought, okay, let's try to look at the historical condition. Maybe that represents what might be a resilient, if you will, level of carbon that these forests can hang on to. So using that predictive model or that statistical model based on precipitation and then climatic water deficit, that map all the way on the left is basically the range of biomass, of live tree biomass, if you're looking throughout that area. And it follows what you might expect, right? Like kind of a common elevational gradient, if you think about it, right? The red, that lower than 20 megagrams per hectare, being in those sort of low elevations, areas we might consider just ponderosa pine or ponderosa pine cedar, maybe even getting a little bit of mixed conifer. And then if you get into some of those oranges, that's when you're getting into true mixed conifer. So now go to the middle map. And the middle map is showing if you use those same breakpoints in precipitation and in climatic water deficit that we modeled the data with from the historical data set, but you projected it out to 2069, I think 2050 to 2069. If you projected it forward, that's what the tree biomass would look like. So again, I know that's probably a little bit complicated, but we took the same splits in the data, the splits in precipitation and so forth, and we kind of fast forwarded, if you will, to the projected climate conditions for the same exact area based on that same basin and characterization model from the Flints. And in essence, what we're saying is, if the past was a template for where we might be headed, we're looking at even much lower tree biomass into the future, which is crazy because we don't have it plotted on here, but if you looked at what we actually have right now, there'd be a huge difference in terms of the projected future biomass based on the historical data set and what we actually see right now. And so anyway, the point here being that we may be looking to our forests too much for holding on to carbon if we can use the past as any reference, because it's not projected to probably hold on to too much carbon given the climatic conditions that were projected. If you look to the right, sorry, this is a long explanation for these series of graphs, but the panel all the way to the right where you're seeing the yellows and greens, that's the difference between the projected future and the historical tree biomass, and it's pretty significant if you're able to look at it. Sorry, it's not, I don't know if you're seeing the legend as well, but we're looking at some changes, in the 10 to 20 to so range of megagrams per hectare, which is pretty darn significant, especially if we're looking to our forest to hold on to even more carbon. I mean, it's just the point being that we shouldn't be trying to overstock our, overpack our forest with carbon. It just doesn't seem like a good plan, given where we're headed climatically, and then let alone, where we think we're headed from a wildfire standpoint. Next slide, please. Okay, last piece. I know you're probably getting tired of all the historical stuff. I find it fascinating, and I think it's neat to try to put these things together. Again, it's complicated. It makes for really complex analyses and a lot of holes, that could be poked in them. But I think it's kind of neat to take that leap every once in a while, to try to pull these data sets together. So this is a totally different data set, but another way to try to look at historical variability. This is from some aerial photos that were on the Plumas National Forest that were taken in the early 1940s. And the funny thing is, I think there is quite a bit of area in California for which there were photos, aerial photos, systematically taken around this time period. We're actually looking at a totally different area near Lake Napa and Sonoma County that has photos from almost the similar time period. So I know there's some that exist on the Mendocino National Forest. So I think that these kind of data might exist, across a much broader swath of California. The point is, where are they? In this case, these photos were sitting in someone's office on the Mount Huff Ranger District of the Plumas National Forest. They were probably passed down from a few generations of silviculturists, and then finally they were handed to us, and we were able to make a cool project out of it. So in general, black and white photos, large area, what we call wall-to-wall, is having continuous photos for about a 250,000 acre area. We were able to then look at change over time, but one of the downsides of these data is we didn't have any plot data that would have corresponded with that 1941 period. So we really don't, we can just sort of visually and, estimate, cover, if you will, forest cover in these kind of broad density classes, but we don't know, we can't tie them to specific numbers on the ground. So that was one of the things that was a little bit of a bummer about this. We couldn't get a trees per acre or a basal area or a canopy cover. We just ended up coming up with these classes. And by the way, next slide, please. We came up with these classes of forest cover that were just bins, essentially, kind of relativizing them. We had, a sparse cover. We had what we call low cover, moderate cover, and dense cover. So what you're looking at on the two maps on the left, the upper one being the historical spatial distribution of these four cover classes, sparse being in that orange category, low being that yellow, moderate being green, and then the brown being the dense forest cover classes. Now, if you go down to the lower graph, we see that it's the same representation of those same cover classes based on imagery from 2005. And one of the things that kind of stands out is you're seeing quite a bit more brown. Now, if you go shift over to the bars on the right, that is the same, same cover classes, with the white bars being the 1941 area, and then the gray being the 2005. And it's kind of interesting. Yes, looking at the bars, we went from about 30% of that quote unquote dense cover to about 45% or so. But it's just interesting that it wasn't more. And I should say, this is 1941. And the last fire, at least based on the nearest reconstruction of fire history in that area, was around the early 1900s, maybe 1905, 1903, or something like that. So it had, missed about 40 years of fire, perhaps. Maybe that could be 2 or 3 fire cycles, we might call that were missed. But it wasn't logged, apparently. According to the forest historian, that area didn't have any real roads going to it at that point in time. There were a few, loads, but none of them significant enough to get logging trucks and equipment up to. So 1941 is not a great benchmark for sort of the more pristine historical condition, but it's okay in this case. We think it's decent. It's, not perfect. And actually, any of these data sets, even those surveys, they all have their drawbacks, as being imperfect. But what we're looking for here is just general patterns of, the historical conditions and perhaps change. So going over to that farthest column, going into this, I really expected a bigger jump, from the historical to current. But a couple things are in play here, one of which being that the historical dense forests, what we call dense historically, may not necessarily be the same as what we're calling dense under the current condition. And that goes back to the lack of plot data that we have, from these particular sites. By the way, next slide, please. And that lack of plot data means that we couldn't really say what was, that dense then equals dense now. And so keep that in mind. But, okay, so the real difference was, I was surprised from a proportional standpoint that we didn't see a bigger difference at 30 to 45. But what the real difference is this graph now. This is showing the area-weighted mean patch size. And you might say, what the heck is that? I've never heard of that. Well, in general, it's a way to try to estimate continuity. How contiguous are some of your largest areas of that particular cover class. And in this case, this is where it really popped out, is that the dense patches are much bigger now. So we have, yes, we have more dense forest now, but it wasn't a huge change. But we have much more contiguous areas of dense forest now than we did historically, right? Historically, some of the largest patches, and that's what this area weighted mean patch size is heavily skewed by your largest patches. So you could almost interpret it as your average largest patches. I mean, that's kind of a funky way, but anyway, bear with me on that one. So your average largest patches historically might have been around 500 hectares, but now your average largest patches are about 5,000 hectares. So that's quite a change. And next slide, please. And for any of you that know this area, you'll recognize what these outlines are. And these are fires from 2006, 2007 up around Antelope Lake. And they were fires that had really significant proportions of high severity. And not surprisingly, a lot of that high severity corresponded with some of those real big patches of dense forest. So that issue of continuity of patch size, I think, is really, really important when we think about how to put these treatments out over the landscape. Now, as you're looking at that perimeter of the Moonlight Fire, you might say, well, why are all those areas cut out? Why weren't they part of the survey area? And we cut them out partly because they're privately managed timberland, and they're on a very different trajectory, currently, from a management standpoint, much more even-aged. And we thought that could really just detract our results. It would always be sort of a weird outlier. So we actually decided to cut that private timberland out and just focus on the Forest Service area. So in any event, the focus here is, I think we could learn from this idea about really focusing on breaking up some of these large patches, and there's good justification for doing so based on some of the historical data. In this particular case, since we had wall-to-wall mapping, you could really show what some of those patches of dense forest might have looked like historically, how big they were, perhaps. Next slide, please.
We have 5 minutes, Brandon.
Okay, got it. I'm about to wrap this up, I hope. Okay, Crystal, you could hit the next two. These are just animations of the final slide. So, okay, I'm going to wrap this up with these points. And so I want to start with this idea that I'm not saying that historical forests, weren't low density. They absolutely were low density. I mean, you see some of those numbers, right, in the 70s in terms of basal area, square feet per acre, but then I think it's important to remember that there was quite a bit of variability. And we see some of that evidence, particularly, I mean, we know that there was this within stand variability. I haven't actually talked about that. That's from some other data sources. If any of you are familiar with Derek Churchill's work, Jamie Lyderson's work from the Stanislaus-Tuolumne Experimental Forest, that really talks about that within stand variability, the gaps, the small gaps, the tree clumps, the individual trees. We know that existed historically from many different sites. I think what we were able to show with some of these is more the landscape level variability, and that there's at least some, it's not just random, that there's some tie to these biophysical gradients, whether it be climatic or, productivity, just based on where snowpack accumulates and soil has better water holding capacity and things like that. So I think those are good templates for moving forward in terms of how we might do a true landscape strategy, right? We're not talking, I think what we still are stuck on from a management standpoint is this idea of just treating stands. That's kind of how foresters are trained, is we go to a stand and we say, what's our objective? And we say, okay, these are our prescriptions, this is our target, and did we meet our target? Well, now I think we really have to embrace a little bit of the complexity of working at a true landscape level, where we're talking about 50,000 acres. I mean, ideally, hopefully we could talk about 100,000 acres, where we're talking about a strategy of some type of manipulation happening on a large part of that landscape. Now, everything doesn't have to be thinned down to 70 square feet of basal area, but we have ways to vary that, and we can tie it to some of the underlying, sort of either climate or biophysical environment. So if you go down to my second bullet point about contemporary forests, we know that they're extremely departed from the historical condition. And I want to emphasize, there's sort of this there's debate to some extent as to, do we do fuel treatments or do restoration treatments? And I think that's kind of it's not really, it's kind of more of just an exercise of, just debating for the debating's sake. It's not either or. You can do both, right? And so we can reduce ladder fuels, we can reduce surface fuels, and we can do restoration all at the same time. And there's good precedent for it, right? We have a template of the historical landscape to do that. And I think what we really need to focus on is really breaking up some of these dense forest patches. We have a heck of a lot more dense forests out in much, much larger patches than we did historically. And we need that landscape level approach to actually break those up. We don't have to go down. I don't think we have to go down to these really extremely low densities. We may not even want that. I mean, to a certain extent, you go down to those really low densities, 20% canopy cover and all that stuff, you're into an area where you have a really strong shrub potential in the understory, and that may not be great from a fire standpoint, at least from a fire hazard standpoint. So, I'm not saying that we have to match these numbers historically, but let's match the process a little bit, the process of variability across a landscape. And I think this last bullet point is something that is going towards a concept of traditional forestry, and even honestly, some of our forest practice rules in California on private land about making sure that sites are fully stocked. If you look at some of our replanting guidelines, we've just, at the state level, we've just modified those. We've been able to reduce what was, our fully stocked stand. We used to have 300 trees per acre was the required minimum on a point count basis, and that was extremely high because, we ended up just having to go back and pre-commercially thin all those. And this idea of maximizing productivity, that goes back to sort of your classic timber production. And I think we need to be thinking about the processes more, the processes of drought, the processes of fire on these landscapes, and give up. We're going to have to give up a little bit of productivity in order to maintain, and sustain these forests, into the future that we think we're headed towards, both from a climatic standpoint and from a wildfire standpoint. So I will end it right there. I apologize again for some of the clunkiness of the, the presentation, and I'm happy to stick around to answer questions.
Okay, and folks, again, this was Brandon is very kindly still joining us all the way from Blodgett Experimental Forest, so we had a bit of a snafu with the internet stuff. But we will move all of your questions. We're past 4 o'clock, so we have to move over to the Zoom discussion where we'll be able to talk through some of these questions, and please join us over in that. I believe the link is in the chat. So please go ahead and move over to the other Zoom for chat. Join me in thanking Dr. Brandon Collins for his fantastic talk. This is amazing. I have so many questions for you, Brandon. And if you can't join us for the chat, then we look forward to seeing you next week for our next seminar. And again, the link for the Zoom is in the chat. So please go ahead and click on that and we'll move over. And Brandon, hopefully, looks like Brandon already left. Okay. Oops.